Appreciate you guys coming in. What my goal over the next 45 minutes or so is to cover a variety of topics. And we recognize, and there's no, certainly up front, there's no one situation that I'm going to describe here that fits all. We understand the complexity of ingredients, what you have available, what you don't. Pricing certainly is going to dictate feed costs, how those ingredients were purchased at different points in time, or if you're on the open market. So taking all those things out, Mike and Bob and Steve that also helped contributed to this presentation. So from an outline, I want to talk about some feed efficiency drivers, some things we need to be thinking about, at least that we feel are important, that are part of the control. Outside of the feed, what are some things that are going to affect feed efficiency in your barns and ultimately help with profitability? Going to spend a little time on feed processing. We spend a lot of time on that. If there is a way, and we need to keep advancing, whether it's in your operation, if for some of you that have your own mills, if you're working with a toll mill, one of the ways that we can get more calories continually is working on feed processing. We have to, of all the advancements left, that is one that there's been a lot done. Our view is, and many others, there's a long way to go to get more calories out of that diet that we're feeding than other types of methods. We want to talk about some different ingredients, go through some diet cost examples, and some additional resources to use once you leave here as well. If we go back in some historical pricing, and again, these are some values. If you look, it's summer prices from June 09, 10, 11, and 12, and then have January here, 13. I guess prices, and we can see the volatility. I think that's obviously one of the things that we can recognize. And it's amazing to think back in June 10, and this is off a mill sheet. We get some here in Iowa and Minnesota, kind of do an average of those. It's amazing to think not that long ago, corn was $3.20. I don't know, maybe I have a bad memory. I have a hard time remembering what I ate for breakfast sometimes. I don't remember $3.20 corn but that wasn't that long ago. It's quite interesting. Obviously, then we had the big jump. And so different ingredients have bounced over time. But what I'd like to point out is down here at the bottom. Basically, the cost to feed that finishing pig from roughly 50 pounds to 280. And you can see in 09, that summer pig, around $60 in 09 and 10. We jumped to about $90 in 11 and 12. And in January 13, we're just short of 100. If we would have done this talk and had those same prices back in October, November, that price would have been somewhere around $115 to $125 a finishing pig, depending on your pricing. So we certainly have seen, obviously, and you know this, that incremental increase. Some of that we can't control. If again, it's back to the purchasing, what I want to focus in on is how feed efficiency outside of some of those costs to lower feed costs, because if we improve feed efficiency incrementally, with feed costs being stagnant or equal, that's where we need to make up some of the difference. How can we be more competitive than the other person by driving feed efficiency? And one of the things I think that's kind of we talk about and we get group comparisons, and if you're maybe part of a grower group, and you throw everybody's feed efficiencies up and you get ranked, does having the best feed efficiency mean that you are the most profitable? Who thinks that's the case? It's not. Certainly it can be if everything else, if you're all in a grower group and you've been feeding the same diets for 6 months, you do all your closeouts and you had the best feed efficiency of the equal rations, maybe you were the most profitable. But I would also say right now, just because of the cost of energy, the cost of added fat, the cost of our higher energy ingredients, we aren't even coming close to maximizing the genetic potential of our animals because we're not feeding them diets that allow that maximum or the best feed efficiency. So I'm going to back up and talk about how do we get the best feed efficiency possible given what we're feeding and given what we're doing. How do we improve upon that? And that's kind of, I think, the message I'd like to go. And again, then the other side is, well, does the lowest feed cost mean that you're going to be the best return? And no, it all depends on your growth rate needs. Revenue of pigs is certainly worth something. If we give up much market weight, we recognize the financial hit we can take because that market price is good relative to history. So we want to make sure we're hitting our market targets given all those constraints. And it's much more complicated today than it has been in the past. It's never been simple by any stretch. But with all the different ingredients and costs, how do we put that together for the optimal return? When we talk about feed efficiency, it's very dynamic. There's a lot of different drivers. There's probably some up here that we don't have listed. But this is kind of a large range of different areas. And I'm going to talk about some of these on the next few slides. But certainly feed efficiency, if we have high feed disappearance, all right, if we have extra wastage, if we have a genetic line that has a high feed intake, maybe they're a little fatter, a little worse feed efficiency. Okay, there's a lot of different things. Temperature. This week I'm going to have some slides on temp. I was watching the weather yesterday here. I think the highs on Saturday here are -2. Okay, we could certainly are going to impact feed efficiency if we don't have the barn ventilated and controlled right in terms of heat, because we're going to give up in terms of what that animal is going to eat extra to maintain that heat that it needs. And we'll talk about that. Low average daily gain, and we're going to talk about some feed processing. Okay, feeder adjustment. Certainly this is one. Back to what's free, okay? We're in the barns, or hopefully we're in the barns quite frequently. Managing the feeders. Not having feed that's just coming out. And it's, you know, if you've heard a person from K-State talk, we talk about this all the time. We feel very strongly about the ability to manage feeders to their optimum. And generally what that means is we've changed our thinking. If we'd be given, again, and several other people, 10 years ago, we would have about a 30% pan coverage. There's been a lot more work done. We've done as well. Now it's basically you want about 50 to 60% pan coverage, okay, through the nursery, through most of the finishing period, and we want to trim that down in towards the late finishing, actually. Those bigger pigs eat more at one time. We don't need to have as much feed in those pans at the end of finishing to improve feed conversion and reduce wastage. But again, we need to have good feeders. I was down through the trade show, and as you walk down through there, the feeders made today, compared to if we'd go through the trade show again 10 years ago, are vastly different. Bigger pans, deeper. The ability for pigs to waste feed out of most feeders that are built today is much less than that of 10, 15 years ago. Or if you have barns, that old, look at we had much narrower pans, shorter front lips, easier to waste feed. Most of the feeders today have the bigger pans, better design. So our ability to waste feed in general is a little bit less, and so we can open them up, and that's what we see a little bit more in most cases. We've done quite a bit of work, and others as well, with different types of feeders. We get this question a lot. What type of feeder do you recommend? Well, that's not an easy answer. Otherwise, no one would be asking the question, right, if you already knew it. So it's a complicated answer, but we've done a lot of work with different wet-dry feeders at our New Horizon farm there at Pipestone we work with. We had a set of Crystal Springs wet-dry feeders in. Did 15 different experiments between there and at K-State, and we summarized those together in analysis from 75 pounds to about 230. And basically the take-home message is in a wet-dry feeder, those pigs certainly will have higher average daily gain. Those pigs come out heavier. If you go the whole length of finishing, generally most of our data would show those pigs are between 11 and 12 pounds heavier than on a good standard dry feeder. And that's mainly due to a higher feed intake. They simply eat more once we put that water availability right in the pan. But what's interesting about that is if you look at feed conversion, absolutely identical. Okay? So those pigs grew faster. We got more weight on the same time. It didn't change feed conversion. And once we put all these together. Now, if we have a wet-dry feeder and we leave it open too much in late finishing, we can really impact and worsen our feed conversion rate. We will start to waste feed at that point. So it's, again, back to later finishing, tightening that feeder down a little bit more, then we'll save our feed conversion. And on the next slide, I'll go through some economics of these types of feeders. The one thing along with that is since we have about a 7-pound heavier carcass, but they are slightly fatter, and then we'll have a slight worsening of lean percentage. Because they were eating more, we just had a little bit fatter animal. So it depends on your packer. There are some, and we send, in Kansas where we're at, producers send quite a few pigs to Triumph, quite a few go to Crete, Nebraska, to farmland there. Farmland, they pulled their leanometer. No pigs are, so we can't send research pigs there anymore because we can't get loin iron back fat. They don't probe them anymore, okay? So depending on your packer and what your incentive is, that may or may not fall into your economics of choosing, in this case, a type of feeder. So if we put some economics to it, looking at a dry and wet-dry feeder on an income over feed basis over those experiments, If we have the same feed conversion, just like we saw on the last, and don't value any worsening of percent lean, it was worth just about $1.60 a pig for that wet-dry feeder. If we take into account a reduction in lean, then it was just about 75 cents a pig advantage. If we didn't adjust that feeder correctly, and we had this in several trials where we left it open too long, worsened feed efficiency, basically at a break even, and then if we combine that, we're down $1. So, what's the best feeder? We got to manage them. Depends what your goals are. It's still hard to beat a good dry feeder in most cases, but wet-dry certainly has some advantages and some growth rate, again, depending on what your situation is, and as you go to replace feeders, making decisions on what's best for you in those cases. All right. Going to switch out to a completely different topic. Let's talk about temperature, okay? Perfect for this time of year, talking about temperature. Again, I know this gets a little tougher to see, but this is the thermal neutral zone. This is where the animals like to be. That's when we're not expending extra energy either to cool off or to heat up the body. And we all know when we're in heat stress, what do they simply do? If an animal's hot, what's it do to its food intake? It goes down, okay? So they're going to eat less, gain less. If we're in cold stress, they're going to eat more to maintain that extra body heat. Their maintenance goes up. And so we're not going to get, and the feed conversion then gets worse because they're eating more and we're not turning that extra feed that they're consuming into gain. And in fact, if you think about if you have 2,400 pigs, 2,400 pig site, and the temperature is 10 degrees below the thermal neutral zone, that's equivalent to those pigs eating about 3.5 tons of extra feed that week, per week that you're going to lose in feed conversion. Okay? That's a lot of extra feed going out that the mill has to make that you're purchasing that you're not getting a return on. So, very important this time of year, we're managing. Downstairs, Steve Pohl and they got Mike Brum, they got the ventilation trailer in. If any of you haven't seen or participated in that activity, ventilation is so key this time of year. We experienced it at K-State this last week. We had a long-time farm employee, Lyle. He passed away 3 weeks ago. Had battled cancer for quite a while. He was our grow finish guy. And so the other farm employees were covering while he was going through some treatment here, and they had the ventilation completely screwed up. Okay? So we went out and did an audit. You know, it's easy to do when you have, in our case, we have undergrad students coming out, grad students, some other full-time, but they're not in those barns all the time. And it just takes a while. Controllers, ventilation isn't easy. Okay? But we need to make sure we're doing it right to prevent sickness, and certainly from a feed conversion standpoint, can make a big difference. Here's some data going back of Staley and Cromwell, summary of 3 experiments, but does a nice job illustrating if the temperature is 50, 72, or 95. You'll see on a gain standpoint, certainly optimum, this is from 50 to 125 pounds, and so this is in that thermal neutral zone. Pigs had the highest gain, relatively close. There's not statistics in this, but if you look at just numerical, certainly get the depression and average daily gain, and we see that in summer heat. That isn't anything new. Why is it? Look at feed intake. Dramatically lower than the thermal neutral pigs, but look at the pigs that were in cold stress. What do? They start to eat more to compensate for that time of cold stress. And then what happens to feed conversion? That's what we're here to talk about. What's going to happen to my feed cost in those cases? The ideal was 2.4 for this group of pigs. Look what happened, up to a 2.9. Okay? And that's a real type of value that we would see when we don't get the barns ventilated and warmed correctly, especially during this winter time, looking at cold stress. Okay. If we look at mortality, how does mortality impact your closeout? Certainly, when we talk about mortality's impact on a closeout feed efficiency, at some point those animals die during that growing period, right? And that feed went to them. Obviously, there's no return, so there's less total weight being sold. So that feed that went to those gets accounted for in your closeout feed efficiency. And generally, okay, if the mortalities occurred at all points from the beginning of finishing to the end, we generally see about a 0.015% or point increase for every percent loss of mortality. So if we had a 2% mortality, this would be a 0.03, okay? So if you had a 2.9, it would be 293 as an example of that, if a 2% mortality. Now, if you have, and if you've experienced it, high mortality at the end of finishing, that number is greatly increased because you had all that feed go in, and now you don't have the weight coming out to account for it on that pounds out of weight versus pounds in of feed. So again, mortality plays a big role. And so again, all the different stressors that come in, stress by itself and disease by itself, if we have a PRRS challenge, different feed efficiency, just in most cases, if mortality doesn't occur, doesn't change all that much. It'll go up slightly. But what the deal with feed efficiency is, its mortality will drive it much more than just a disease level if mortalities don't occur during that time. Okay? So here's an example. Jay Gisella, this is a commercial study. We just looked at circovirus vaccine. Okay? Looking at control group that was not vaccinated, a group in the same barn, every other pen we did. Again, feed conversion was improved. This was driven solely due to more mortalities at that time due to the related disease that came with that within those pigs. Okay? So again, disease will impact your feed efficiency, and we just recognize that that's part of what we have to deal with. Certainly the mortalities at the end of finishing are certainly more detrimental than earlier on based on they've already consumed that feed. Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about feed processing. So we're going to switch back to a topic for a little bit here and just recognize that some of you may or may not have control of this. Okay? If you're a contract grower, the feed's being delivered. That isn't something you necessarily have your fingers on directly. But for those that are owners or if you have your own mill, these are the things that, again, we continue to look at, many others look at as well. But we have to find more ways to get calories out of that bite of feed. Feed processing is one of the means that we can potentially do that. And so that's why we, again, us and plenty of other people look at this as well. One of the things before I wanted to just quickly mention is back to the premixes. I think just part of the overall quality control side. Again, the premixes that you work with, the VTMs, again, depending how fast you go through them, I know certainly the trend in the industry, and for many good reasons for certain producers, have been to combine those together based on having them for a short period of time in terms of storage. But again, we still find when we go out with producers in Kansas and other places and mills, VTMs that have been there 6 months, 8 months, new bags put on the old bags where the old bags weren't put on top, just the general rotations. And then we just get all the questions, the vitamin D thing that's been so hot. Well, the reality is there was some cases, and there was different premixes that it was omitted. We have a graduate student from another university. Their pigs were without vitamin D for a good period of time where they were getting the premix from, didn't have it. I mean, it happens, all right? It's not exactly a common occurrence. Vitamins are left out. Mistakes happen. We all experience mistakes that we do. But we just need to make sure that you're working with a reputable blender, you're doing some testing, all right? And so then we don't let some of the crazes that I would call of certain vitamins or different minerals just get out of hand. And so again, I think just having a good protocol in place, things that we need to make sure that we're looking at as part of our quality control on the whole feed side. This is some work that we did. This was a National Pork Board funded grant. New Fashion Pork was a partner in this, and we made the feed and utilized their finishing facility last year. And what we have here, this is the same diet being fed. This is a corn, soybean meal based diet, but it contains 30% distillers and 20% wheat mitts. So 50% of this diet is byproducts, and so only about 40% of this diet is corn. Okay, only about 40% is corn. So I want to make sure we point that out. And so this is the same diet being fed. In the first diet, corn was ground to 600 microns, pretty typical. Most people, what do you recommend? Corn particle size, 550 to 650, so kind of right in that range. We ground the corn down to about 300, is actually about 3 1/4 is what the final was. Fed in meal or pellet, so the blue is meal, the red's pellet. And then this last one is we mixed the diet, re-ran it, I use the term we very loosely here, okay? The mill ran it back, after we mixed the diet, ran it back through a hammer mill and ground the whole diet down, would end up being about 3 1/4, okay? So we ground the whole diet, so the distillers, wheat mids, soybean meal, everything back down. And what you'll see is, again, let's just look at the meal. We reduce the corn particle size as expected. When we reduce corn particle size, we expect more energy from that corn. We expect an average daily gain boost. And in fact, we did. But you'll see when we ground the whole diet, nothing changed. And we'll get to that on the next slide. The pigs didn't like it. It was too fine. It was too powdery a diet. Palatability, in our view, that's what that issue was. But you'll see once we pellet, took gain up, in this case, about a tenth, incrementally a little bit more with the whole diet being ground. We look from a feed conversion standpoint. That's really what we're going after. Again, back to the feed processing side. We took off about a tenth of feed conversion in the meal diet when we only ground the corn. We pelleted, had the further increase. And that's what we'd expect. When we ground the whole diet, look at feed conversion. It was basically identical in the meal form, and it was identical in pellet form. What this tells us is that the corn, we got our benefit from grinding the corn finer. But what it also tells us is when we reground the whole diet, ground the wheat mids, ground the distiller grains, ground the soybean meal that was in there back through, feed efficiency was not improved any further. So, grinding those ingredients did not give us a benefit. Because there's been talk, and we've been looking at it too, do you post-grind everything? And let's get more calories. This would say that it's probably not an efficient way of doing that, okay? That the corn, and remember, we still got this feed conversion bump with only 40% of the diet being corn, okay? That was done last year. Summer. It's during the summer. Yeah. So if we look on an income over feed cost, applying economics to the mixing, the grinding, all the time and tonnage going through, about $53 on income over feed cost on the standard corn meal diet. When we ground, was worth about $4, $4.50 to the finer micron size of 300, going from 6 to 300. Pelleting gave us the further benefit. But you'll see here, when we fed the whole diet that we reground just in meal form, remember pigs didn't like it, they didn't gain as well. There was no advantage over that of just the regular corn, 600 micron diet. But again, then when we pelleted that diet, brought us back up. But ideally, we're here. And so this is back to grinding corn fine, feeding it in a good pellet form. And when I say good pellet, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, we define pellets, we think, and based on all the data and other experiences, that at the feeder, there needs to be 15%, less than 15% of that diet it can be in fines. If you have a diet that's 25, 30% actual fines in the feeder, you're not going to get, you may get a small, but you've basically given up all of your pelleting costs back. And one of the main reasons that people, yeah, go ahead. Yes, pelleting cost as well. And basically, good point. So we put all costs in, and especially in these when we had to regrind everything, because we already ground the corn once, because we're going to do that. We're not going to put whole corn, maybe we could, whole corn in the mixer and regrind everything. It was already, so that corn got counted twice. But yeah, so again, it's back to just availability of pellets. And, I'll give you a good example. In Kansas, we don't have we're not as large a swine industry as certainly as what you have here in Minnesota. We don't have the toll mills. We have a handful. Smithfield looked to put it in a bunch. They're putting in a whole bunch of new contract growers in Nebraska right now. They looked at Kansas, and they didn't come to Kansas because we didn't have the pelleting. We don't have mills that could pellet high amounts, and they were, they didn't want to build it. They couldn't justify a mill themselves, and so they're working with toll mills in Nebraska and putting up a whole bunch of new finishers right now. And so again, it's back to, can I get pellets? And producers, where's my break point? If I have my own mill, where can I justify? It's an expensive venture in, and so where does that bounce? But we know some of the benefit that can potentially come from it if it works within the system. And so if we go back to some historical data, looking at in 94, 95, from 800 to 400 microns work done in finishing. Again, these were fatter pigs, our genetics at time, but it was about 1.2% improvement for every 100 microns. We look at the two trials that we just have recently completed, it's about 1%. And again, I think part of that is only 40% of the diet was corn, and these we're looking at 80%. So basically, we're still around 1.2% improvement for every 100 microns. This is why many toll mills, many manufacturers have moved from that 750, 6 to 700 target down to 5 to 600. And there's several producers that if they have their own, and you can only really do it through a hammer mill, get down to that 350. Okay? Again, that is a very consistent response that we see. And so again, but it's back to the handling. How fine can you grind so it doesn't stick up in my band in a meal diet? Then if you add some fat in, then it makes it that much worse. Roller mill corn flows much, much better than hammer mill corn. If you have roller mill ground corn, that's equivalent to hammer mill corn with about 3% added fat in it. Okay? Roller mill flows much better. But unless you have a 3 or 4 high roller mill, you're not going to get down to 350, 400. About 500 for a lot of producers is as fine as a roller mill can take it that most are set up on. So it's the give and takes and where the costs are and what opportunities and how you can balance that. But those are some real. It's about $1 a pig right now for every 100 microns. The one thing too, I didn't get it on here, is how it's tested. If you send your particle size off to a lab, ask the question, are you using a flow agent or not? A flow agent is like limestone, some type of agent that basically helps the corn flow through the big stack of screens to get the particle size. If a flow agent, all of the data up here that's been done and other researchers as well, that is not using a flow agent. If I use a flow agent, your particle size will look about 80 microns lower than it actually is. So if you get back your report and it says it's 500 and they used a flow agent, you're really 580. Okay? There's nothing wrong with using a flow agent, but just make sure that it's a big difference. That's almost, again, back to $1 a pig. If you think you're 500 and you're really 580, that's just short of $1 a pig, depending on where your target is. So again, make sure you ask that question. That's a big deal, and most people don't realize that. Many labs use flow agents, so just make sure you take that into account. Okay. Here's a study. We did at New Horizon Farms in Pipestone. This was another pork board funded study, and this would deal with soy hulls. We've done a lot of work with soy hulls over this last year, and one of the things we wanted to do is here we have a high fiber, low energy ingredient. Cereal grains work really well to grind them finer and get better feed efficiency. What if we grind soybean hulls as an example? Can we improve the calories we get out of finely grinding something that's not very digestible? Okay? So we fed at 7.5% and 15%. These were all meal form diets, 68 to 280 pounds. And what I want you to see on a feed conversion, as we would expect, feeding more soy hulls made feed conversion worse because it's lower energy, and so we expected that. But what we did not expect is, you look, this light purple bar compared to the red bar, the red is unground, so that had been about 700, I believe it was around 700 microns was the soybean hull size. We grinded it down to 350. Feed conversion got worse. We did this in the nursery as well, exact same thing. We were like, what in the world here now? All right, back to the simple mind of me, you grind it finer, get better digestibility. Don't have proof, but basically my belief is, and some others that we visited about, the more fibers in the diet, the lower digestibility of that diet becomes. Fiber ties up the enzymes you can't digest, everything else is good. What we did was we took a high fiber ingredient, create a whole bunch more surface area, and maybe decrease the overall digestibility of the other nutrients in that diet. Don't know, but it makes sense based on the consistency of that. Our goal here was, again, take something poor quality, can we enhance it? Probably not. And maybe that's why, back to the previous study, when we grinded up the wheat midds and distillers we didn't change feed efficiency either. So we're kind of seeing a pattern. Maybe, unfortunately, regrinding some of these lower quality ingredients may not give us a benefit that going in we hypothesized maybe we could get. So grain particle size, feed efficiency is directly impacted by the cereal grains that we utilize. In the research with high coal product diets, when corn's decreased, pigs still respond, even though corn's a smaller portion of the diet. Whole diet grinding does not appear to be a benefit in meal diets. Or when we repelleted it, we did get an average daily gain response, but nothing on feed conversion. Again, the high fiber, low digestibility ingredients may negatively be affected by particle size reduction. I think certainly that was some of the first work being done. We're going to follow up with some more of that, but doesn't appear to be promising, unfortunately. And again, back to the testing method, if we're using a flow agent or not. 80 microns is generally how much lower it'll be when we use that in the test. Okay, back to pelleting a little bit. Here's a summary of trials that we had been involved with from 2005 to 2011 in grow finish. A lot of numbers here, but bottom line, average response for good quality pellets, and again, we define this as 15% fines or less, 5% for average daily gain, 4% for feed conversion. Kind of the rule of thumb so at least it's normally kicked around is if a good quality pellet's 4 to 6% improvement in gain and feed efficiency, that kind of falls right in that line. So again, pelleting pays for itself more in high feed price times because there's a greater opportunity for return versus when it's low. We're certainly in high feed price times. And so again, as we look at the economics of it, projecting out where we're at, that I think we need to make sure we're using reflective values if we're going to look at pelleting or not.
What size pellet are you using?
No, none of this would be mini pellets. Just a standard pellet, yeah. Yeah, and the work that's done, I mean, Joe Hancock, who's at K-State, he basically made cow cubes for nursery pigs, and the cow cubes hurt, but you can make a dang big pellet, and they'll still gnaw on it like little rats, and get to it. So, you have a good quality pellet, but yeah, none of this is mini pellets, standard pellet size. Okay. So here's an example. This was a study done again with New Fashion and Ernie at Hubbard Feeds and with their the research nursery looking at pellet quality. Jeremiah Nemechek, one of our grad students, was involved. Again, 30 to 70 pound pigs, a feed conversion of 159 on the meal. We pelleted, got a typical pelleting response and good quality pellets. When we have 30% pellets or 30% fines, look what happened to feed conversion. Right back up to feeding the meal diet. Okay? So again, if we're going to go through the cost of that, we need to make sure we're trying to make as good a pellet as possible. Some have recirculators to get the fines and repellet those. One of the big reasons that some of the people that have had pellet mills for some time, they haven't really cared about pellet. They cared about it, but they gave up pellet quality. The real reason that they were pelleting was to grind corn to 300 microns to get it to flow and basically make a crumble out of the feed to make sure it could get through the system. But if we can get the additive effect of a good quality pellet, those are additive and make a huge difference on our final feed conversion. Okay, this is hard to see, and there's a lot of fines. Trust me, you can actually see pellets if we had the lights, you can see that. So again, we want to see pellets in the feeder trough, all right? If it's all fines, we're just giving up that advantage. Okay, I'm going to switch to different feed ingredients. I'm going to run through a few different ones, and again, this is not easy. Depends how many bins you have, depends what you can buy, price, how many you want to mess with, all those things. But one of the things that certainly is on the forefront of a lot of minds is with, again, all the distiller stuff. At some point, I'd like to be done with distillers research, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. We're finally getting to a point when before we started spinning oil out, I think most of us had a pretty good handle that good quality distillers was fairly equivalent to corn on an energy basis. Pigs, we could feed 20 to 30% in the diets, not get hurt on performance. There's a lot of things we're getting actually finally comfortable with. Now we start spinning fat out. Now we got all these different products floating around, and now we have to refigure out how to value these different ingredients. Here's a medium oil distiller grains product. It's a 7.2% fat product, and we just added it in. So we didn't adjust energy. We just want to see the response of including it from 0 up to 45%. Here's average daily gain. We linear decreased average daily gain as we increase this 7% fat product. Generally, a normal distiller's product that doesn't have fat spun out would be about 10 or a little greater than that. So when we pull out fat, we pull out calories, those animals responded and gained less. That falls right along with feed conversion. Again, from 0 to 45% of the diet, or 7.4% oil, feed conversion linearly got worse. If we would run this same trial with full fat or normal distiller grains, most of our data and most others would show at least up to this 30%. We may not change feed conversion much at all. Some cases it actually improves if it's a better, higher quality fat or a higher fat product. But again, we'd expect, but you can see lower oil, lower energy, feed conversion gets worse. So how do we value this? Where does it all come back in? Those are the things that we have to wrestle with in terms of trying to come up with good values for these distiller products, because they're all over the board right now out there. Yield standpoint. One of the things, and again, if you haven't seen this, I mean, one thing that's extremely consistent when feeding any ingredient that's higher in fiber. Here's an example of distiller grains. We could put wheat midds, we could put soy hulls, we could put any fiber, higher fiber containing ingredient up here. And if it gets fed at a higher level all the way to the day of marketing, yield will be less. And that is because, and I'll show in these next couple ones towards the end some pictures of the amount of digesta that gets retained in the gut increases. More fiber, a thicker digesta. So again, we don't get paid on yield, we get paid on weight. But if you're weighing pigs at the farm and they're hitting a weight target, and then you go and sell on the carcass weight, it actually get paid on, okay? So again, those discrepancies, why is that? You'll see a substantial hit in yield comes because of the more fiber in the diet fed all the way to the end. That's why I would suspect any diet, it's rare to see any diet that's fed that still has this high level of distillers, wheat midds, whatever fiber ingredient that may be fed in the Paline diet or in the last diet prior to marketing. This yield hit is real, it's consistent. Basically, everybody's shown it. We know it's part of it. So that's oftentimes why we see a reduction there at the end in terms of the amount that's utilized in the diet to recover some of the yield. And I'll show some slides in a little bit on some examples of that. Okay? One of the good things, I should frame good things with lower oil distiller grains, is that one of the concerns is that we're feeding more unsaturated oil with distiller grains. You know, it's a softer fat, so carcass IV gets worse. Generally, if we look at all the data that's been done looking at carcass firmness, IV is one of the typical ways that that's measured and the way packers are measuring it. For every 10% distiller grains in the diet of a full fat of normal distiller grains, IV value would go up 2 points. So if you're feeding 20% distillers, you'd expect your IV value to be 2 points higher, most generally. Ooh, I didn't mean to do that. All right. In this case where we have lower oil going in, it's inherent that we're going to have less of that same oil being deposited into the fat of that pig. So, for those that are being monitored and checked on a carcass quality basis by your packer, utilizing lower oil distiller grains actually provides some advantage, the only advantage that I can see, because you're not feeding as much of that soft fat. And so again, it goes up, but we'd expect this on a normal distiller grains to be about 76 instead of 74. Okay, so it is related in that case. So, distillers quality control, we got to know what we're feeding. There's several companies, nutrition, many of the nutritionists, they do a lot of testing. There's companies that have whole programs set up around ingredient monitoring. It's imperative we know that what we're feeding. And so again, we look at the energy value on a net energy basis at the different distiller grains levels, and it certainly drops off a cliff fast when we get to the lower oil distiller grades. And we need to make sure if we're feeding this, boy, we need to make sure we don't have the specifications in for this, because we are going to be extremely disappointed. And now we overvalued it, our pigs are growing slower, feed conversion's worse, and our profitability is not going to be good if we're not valuing it correctly. Okay. Another thing, here in Minnesota especially, there's a lot of different opportunities for some other ingredients. Bakery gets used throughout the Midwest as some potential options. This is one we've done more work, and some others have as well, trying to make sure that we're valuing bakery meal correctly. This is all the human food that doesn't make specs. This is all the cookies, crackers, gobstoppers, totes of Kool-Aid, whatever it is that doesn't make the cake mixes, all that stuff. More than ever, we're blending that is not getting landfilled as much, and as plants have went more green, they're certainly helping to vote more of those products, and so they do get available at times. My take-home message with bakery, and I'm going to show a data slide on it. Again, if we look at book values, and book values are generally a starting spot, and then we adjust and look at how we want to evaluate. If we look at the new NRC, it has about 8% fat, about 13% higher ME in terms of calories than corn. So if you were to take that book value and say, man, I can afford to pay more for bakery than I can for corn. All right? We've recently did some work, again, back at New Horizons, working with a bakery product. And as we looked at, I'm just going to go ahead and skip to our feed conversion. If we used a book value and had that as a loading value, we increased bakery 7.5% and 15%. What happened to feed conversion? Get better or worse? Got worse. On that last slide, didn't I say it was supposed to have 13% more energy, so shouldn't have it got better? Well, yeah. The problem was this bakery product was about 6% fat, so again, reduced it down. It was worse. How you value these ingredients, it's so important. It's so important, and we have to have good quality control in place to make sure. And it's not easy. It's hard to develop. What is that actual energy value to assess to these? There's many different ways of doing it, but again, it's being consistent of how you do it within your feed company, within your operation, how your nutritionist. Because I can have a way different value than Wayne has, and we're both right. As long as we have it valued, all of our ingredients the right way in a ratio within our formulations. So again, we can all use different values, and we all could be right, but it's still relative to the other ingredients, so you're valuing your ingredient pool correctly. Okay, added fat. We could just say, basically just use added energy. Okay, I think that's kind of a message. I'm going to use a fat calculator. We have one that we use, many others do as well. How do we use added fat in diets? Okay, I plugged in some prices, $7.05 corn, $4.20 bean meal, 40-cent fat. If I look out to May, about $95 carcass price. What I would see on this is, again, basically with the more energy we feed, we're going to get an improvement in average daily gain. We're going to get an improvement in feed efficiency. This would tell me right now, at least in our model, that feeding some fat early in the finishing period would have some returns. It would be negative later on. And again, there's a lot of different ways to value that. That's one way that we look at it. And so how do we look at what energy level to feed? And this just doesn't have to just be fat, but as we pull in different ingredients. So added fat recommendations. One of the things, and that last tool is an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll show you on our website where that's at. Anybody can go in and plug numbers and play with that. One of the things that I think that I often hear is we get into June and it's really hot. So what's the first thing that everybody wants to do? It's June and it's hot and market weight's going down. What do? I need to feed fat. And if you're going to feed fat, what do you put it in? All your diets? Okay? When should those you know what's going to happen in June and July this year. Last time I checked, it's going to get hot. Okay? And in Minnesota, you're going to have big mosquitoes. All right? I know two things. All right? So, it's going to get hot. Market weights are going to come off. We already know that. When should we start feeding fat then? When should those pigs, if we want to hit a higher market weight in summer, it isn't wait until June and it gets 95 in the barn. Because what are we doing then? We're trying to maintain versus enhancing our highest revenue time. Summer is our highest revenue time, historically based on market price. That's when we want to sell our weight. We need to start getting those pigs going earlier. When those pigs are placed in February and March into the finisher at 50 pounds, those start to be our summer marketed pigs. We need to, at that point, value summer price, value our ingredients, and start getting that growth rate sooner. I see way too many producers come June, now let's dump in fat. We're behind. We're way behind. The other side of that is pigs that are placed, it's still hot in July and August. We're still feeding fat. I got 50-pound pigs now coming in August. The question is, should those pigs be fed fat or not? It costs more. My diet cost just went up. If I placed a 50-pound pig in August, into July into August, when are those marketed? November? Into October, November? When are generally, again, I'm using generally loosely, when are most people behind in marketing? When do pigs take off? After new crop corn? We generally, sometimes, again, not every year, we're trying to get pigs out the door faster because the growth rate's taken off. Why did we feed expensive fat back to them in August, and now we're maybe going over where we want to be in our market weight in October, November? Target the marketing times better with energy. And so again, many producers do that. I see many not doing that probably as well. And it's very dynamic. Every situation's different. And there's plenty of reasons not to do what I just said. For some of you, there's maybe plenty of reasons to do that. So again, just think about when added energy needs to be utilized to maximize that market weight. Don't try and play catch up. And too often we try and play catch up in summer when it's too late. Okay, I want to run through some different diets real quick, some example potential diets. This is for one phase, 125 to 170 pounds of body weight, 705 corn, 420 bean meal. I'm using full fat distiller grains, even though that's a minority to find that anymore. I'm using that for this demonstration. Wheat mids at 245, meat and bone, and so on. All right, there's a lot of information on the last slide that I won't get through, but if we look at a corn soy diet, I was corrected. Steve Dreetz, I put up normal, and one of my colleagues busted my chops, said there's no normal anymore. I just call it corn soy, which is right. Okay, so a corn soy diet, one that has higher synthetic amino acids to lower bean meal. We have some meat and bone potentially to use, 30% distillers, 20% wheat mids, or the combination of that very high byproduct diet, 30 distillers, 20% wheat mids. Ultimately, what I want you to do is come down. We have the feed costs. We can certainly decrease feed costs, but the feed budgets, in this case, I did not adjust for energy. I just dumped them in, did not add fat to balance energy. So when we feed wheat mids, feed conversion is going to get worse in this phase because it's lower energy. So it's going to take more feed, 122.7, versus 120 of that corn soy diet to get the same gain because feed conversion's worse. If we look at feed cost across, high synthetics save us some money. In this case, meat and bone actually basically breaks you even. Distillers is still the big thing. Of all the alternatives out there, the reality is distillers is still the highest value alternative outside of corn and soy meal that most of us can get our hands on. It's not nearly what it once was about a year and a half ago. Typically, 30% distillers a year and a half ago would save us $6 to $8. We're kind of in that $3 range now. Okay? And again, when we combine both of them, you'll see this is the lowest feed cost. So man, is that my message? Everybody go out and feed a bunch of distillers and a bunch of mids. Okay? For some, it may work. If you have extra space, you can take extra time, feed the lower feed costs, but you're also going to give up. You need more days to hit your market weight. So again, it's evaluating diet costs and market weight where you want to be. I don't want to point out this is the diet to feed, but it's the different options and how we need to evaluate what type of diet to feed. And so I want to finish with some example of this, and this is exactly that last diet and why potentially we may not want to feed that diet. Here is, I realize there's a lot going on, but realize this is a finishing trial from 90 to 270 pounds, fed either 0, 15, or 30% distillers, or 0, 9.5, and 19% mids. And the low is corn soy. So these pigs were fed, and this is on a yield basis. This is back to my yield example, why those high byproduct diets hurt us on final carcass weight. Yield is 73. When we fed this diet, which is 30% distillers, 19% mids all the way through, we gave up a substantial amount of yield. Most producers, again, are back in this middle where we could feed a high byproduct for most of finishing, then either most producers drop back to a medium type diet that contains lesser amounts or back to a corn soy for that last 2-3 weeks. Again, different producers handle different ways. You'll see in this case, what did we do to yield? We fed that high byproduct diet basically 3/4 of the way through, threw them back on corn soy, and brought our yield and ultimately our carcass weight came back as a reflection of that. Okay? And you'll see that with the carcass weight, again, feeding high byproduct, doing that taper, but when we don't taper off and leave them on high, low energy, man, we just get really knocked on our final carcass weight on those fixed days. All right, so here's a picture. This is the fun stuff grad students, I tell them they don't know how good they have it because they'll be able to tell these stories the rest of their lives. So how do we know how much digest is still in the large intestine? You collect it and clean it out, okay? This is an example of, this is digest that we're squeezing, and I will use we, I was helping, along with taking pictures, squeezing out, look how thick this digest is of distillers and wheat midds. That stuff we'd have to cut that large intestine about every foot to get it squeezed out. If you had the corn soy diet, the stuff you can just squeeze right out, okay? So back to fiber, makes it dense, and ultimately, if you look at full intestine weight, so we get to weigh all this stuff, all right? So again, the glamour of grad school. The pigs that were fed corn and soy their whole finishing period, their large intestine weighed about 6.6 pounds, okay? Those fed the high byproduct diet the whole way through weighed 8.7, okay? About a third of that is actually the intestine weighs more. If you feed fiber, the digestive tract actually gets a little bit thicker itself, the lining does. But almost all that was extra manure still just retained in there. And these were on a 12-hour withdrawal. So there were 12 hours off the feeder prior to slaughter. And again, then we had all the intermediates based on the flow through. So again, based on how we balance all this, okay, kind of what the point I want to get across. Some additional resources at our ksuswine.org. We have a distiller's calculator, synthetic amino acid, the fat calculator that I showed earlier. We have some feed budget calculators. You can enter basically your target feed conversion and weights, and it'll spit out how much per phase, and as you make your phases, feeder adjustment, particle size information, some marketing calculators, and gestation tools. This is the site. And again, here in the center is where all those can be located at. There's a new website that's actually, it's really being announced here next week when National Hog Farmer comes out. The swinefeedefficiency.com. This is a joint project, Iowa State, K-State, and others. We have a 5-year USDA grant, and part of what we're doing is looking at ways to enhance feed efficiency. And one of the things that we did this fall is we put together a dozen front-back quick fact sheets on different feed efficiency drivers. And again, these are some general take-home rules, rules of thumb, easy to read, bottom line type information. And so again, those are out on that site. If you want to read or give those to other people within your company or other growers, simple things, especially when we get into temperature, pelleting, just a whole variety of different areas that we tried to cover that influence feed efficiency.